Okay, so we're back. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and apply a new lens shader available in exercise 7 called the Bouquet lens shader. So let's see how that works. Let's go ahead and let's go to render. We'll go to pass options. Now if we go to pass shaders, all we have now is an environment shader. What we want to do is come down here to the lens shaders and switch from use only camera lens shaders, and we're going to go with overwrite camera lens shaders. And we're going to go to add, and now a browser will open up, and what you want to do is go ahead and select this MIA Bouquet lens. Okay, so let's go ahead and select that one, load it up, and let's open up its PPG, see what we have here. Let's lock that down. Now before we do anything, let's go ahead and do a preview render and see what we have. Now one thing I have to warn you about is that the Bouquet lens shader is basically a different type of depth of field lens shader for use of your cameras with mental ray. Now the one thing about this shader is that because you're doing depth of field and there's going to be a lot of artifacting involved, you're going to need a lot of anti-aliasing to make this look good. We can also control the quality using the sample parameter built into the shader, which can allow us to render fast or slow. Of course, the faster renders, the uglier the render is going to look, like it is in this case. As you can see, as my render is progressing, it doesn't look too great. Looks very blurry, looks very filled with artifacts, just doesn't look good. It's just not ready for production, plain and simple. Okay, so let's see how we can change that. Let's go ahead and close that. The neat thing about this shader, and probably the most notable thing, is that it can create an effect known as chromatic aberration. This is an effect that happens when using photographic cameras and film with your actual lens. Okay, video editor, we're editing that out of the video. We're going to regroup at the part we're talking about chromatic aberration. So let's just end that there, and we'll start over in 3, 2, 1. One of the neat things about this Bouquet lens shader in exercise 7 in mental ray is the fact that it creates a distortion known as chromatic aberration. This happens in the real world with cameras when a lens has a different refractive index, and it goes ahead and it disperses the wavelengths of light. This causes the edges of objects in photographs to have this sort of these different colors. What you'll see is red, green, and blue, kind of dispersed, and it causes a sort of effect that looks more realistic. Now, of course, the explanation makes probably no sense, so what we'll do is we'll do a test render so that I can show you visually what it is that I'm talking about, because it's a little bit difficult to explain. Okay, but the first thing I'll do before I do that is change some of my focus settings here so I can see my scene a lot better. Now the first setting you see here is the focal plane distance. If you've ever worked with a depth of field shader before, this will make perfect sense to you, and you'll probably already know how to use this parameter. If not, it's a pretty simple parameter to use. Basically, it's the distance at which the camera lens shader, in this case the Bouquet lens shader, is going to go ahead and focus. So it's going to focus either 100 units in or more or less, depending on what you choose basically. So right now it's going to focus at 100 units away from the camera out there in our scene. So that may not be good. So I'm going to lower that distance to something like 65, which is going to work out well for this scene. And let's go ahead and do another preview render here. And I'm probably just going to fast forward through this so you don't have to see this rendering so much. So it's wrapping up here. Didn't take too long, just about a minute or two. And this parameter here, the Cof Radius, is going to control this blurriness. As you can see, it's very blurry. The gold sphere back here is starting to get into focus, but everything else is totally out of focus and it doesn't look too great. So how can we fix that? Well, we fix that using the Cof Radius. The higher this radius, the more of this blurry effect you're going to have. So it's going to be a very concentrated depth of field effect. If you lower this radius, you'll have a less concentrated depth of field effect with this shader. So let's lower that radius to about 0.1 so we get ourselves a nicer look. And another thing to note is the less of that blurriness that you have, the less anti-aliasing is required to render out a good image, and the less samples you need with the shader. So you end up with a much better looking, a faster render. as opposed to waiting too long when you have too much of that blurriness going on there, which actually doesn't look too great. Now, probably the next most important parameters, there's actually two very important parameters I really want to talk about. And that's going to be the samples parameter. The lower the number of samples, the lower the quality of this lens shader is going to look like in your final render, but the faster it's going to render. If you increase these samples, you're going to get a much nicer render with less artifacts, but your render time is going to shoot through the roof. So just be aware of that. Very important. Sampling bias, the blade count, and the angle, basically shutter blade parameters down here, aren't very important. What they do is they control basically very subtly, they control the effect or the shape of the blurring effect when you're using this depth of field shader. Now, me personally, I don't like to use these settings because they don't give me a lot of control, and they don't give me really cool effects like chromatic aberration and things like that. So I just ignore these shaders. These parameters like sampling bias, the blade count, and the shutter blade angle. What I like to do is use a bokeh image. So what in the world is a bokeh image, you're probably wondering? Well, let's go ahead and find out. I'm going to go ahead and select that, and let me close the render preview. Now, by selecting it, you'll notice nothing really happened. You see? So I'll select it, and let's do render preview and see what happens. And you notice that we have all these strange little colors. Basically all these red, greens, and blues and violets all over the place. Well, this is because when we're using a bokeh image, we're pretty much turning on the chromatic aberration feature of this shader. And if you look at the render very closely, it's a very subtle change. And if it's a little bit hard to see, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you to notice the change. What I'll do is I'll close that, I'll turn that off, and I'll do a render preview. And I'll fast forward so you don't have to see the rendering process. Okay, so that didn't take too long to render. It's about a minute and change. And what we see here is an image with basically no chromatic aberration. We do have the depth of field effect working, but there's no chromatic aberration. So I'm going to lock that one down. Now I'm going to check this parameter on. So it's basically turning on the chromatic aberration, but it needs an image in order to be able to do that. So I'll render again. I'll place this one about down here, and you can see all the strange colors popping up. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let that render for about a minute, and then I'll be right back. Okay, there we go. That didn't take too long. Let me lock that one down. Now, if you look at these two comparisons, it's a very subtle difference, but it's actually a pretty big difference when you really carefully analyze the images. The image on the bottom is using an image, the default image clip in XSI, to create this sort of chromatic aberration effect. That's why we see these different colors everywhere. If you look at, say, this back wall on the image, on this bottom render, and look at the before render, you notice that it looks completely different. You also notice that around the edges of objects and in certain areas we have this sort of chromatic aberration effect. And if you're still not sure what a chromatic aberration effect looks like, just go on Google really quick and do a search for chromatic aberration, and you'll see plenty of photographic examples on what to look for in chromatic aberration, what the effect actually looks like, and you'll start to understand this a little bit better. So you can see the image on the bottom looks totally different. The colors look a bit different. It's slightly different, but it's just enough to make a nice subtle difference. And I like the bottom image better. Looks more photographic in my opinion, and more realistic, more believable as a photorealistic image. So let me close both of these. And now remember that I mentioned we're using a bokeh image, but it's using the default image from XSI, which is obviously no good. So how can we fix that? Well, let's close that. Let's open up the Explorer here, and we'll hit P for passes, just to switch over here to the pass menu here. And what we want to do is select the HDRI pass and just hit 7 on the keyboard to open up a render tree for the pass. And you'll see the MIA bokeh lens shader right here. See it? And you can see it's using a no icon pick in that shader as the image. So when we turned on this image parameter for the bokeh lens shader, it's using this default pick as the image, which is no good. So what can we do to fix that? Well, let's go to clip, and let's create a clip from file. And the clip that we want to create or bring in here is going to be this image here called bokeh map .tga. It's a targa because it has an alpha map. Now if we open that up, this is the image that we have. It's basically an image where we have these three color swatches, red, green, and blue, or RGB. And this has an alpha. If I right click on here and go to display channel and I go to alpha, it has an alpha channel. It's very important for your bokeh image to have an alpha channel in order for it to be used by the lens shader correctly. Okay, so the next thing I'm probably going to do is come here and change the color profile to Srgb. Very important. It's not an HDR image, so I want to switch it over to Srgb. Now you notice that it's not here. Right now we have this one right here, this no icon pick 2. So let's go over here to clips and let's pull in the bokeh map. And it looks like we got 2 of them, so I'll just pull this one down in here. And there it is. I'll take it and plug it into the only place I can plug it into, which is the bokeh port right there. And there we go. Now I'll open up the PPG here, collapse some of these. So we're using a bokeh image and we're using the correct type of image, which is that map right there. Okay, so now let me close that and let me go ahead and do another render preview and see what we get. You'll notice as it's doing the final gathering that the color pattern looks totally different. Now we're using just red, green, and blue because of course we've switched the image out for the correct image. One important thing to make note of when you're using a bokeh image, the shutter blade parameters, both the blade count and the angle, as well as the sampling bias, become obsolete. They make no difference no matter what changes you make to them because the bokeh image is controlling the chromatic aberration and the depth of field effect. You can see our colors are now normalized. They look more to how they're supposed to look. It doesn't have that saturated look from the previous render when we were using the no icon default pick. Now that we're using the correct bokeh image, we're actually getting a much more accurate colors here coming into our render. Okay, but we can still see the chromatic aberration effect. It's a very subtle effect, but it's there and it makes a pretty nice difference, pretty nice addition to our render. Okay, so there's the render. Didn't take too long to render. Looks pretty good. Very nice. I love this bokeh lens shader. It's just fantastic. Alright, so that's the bokeh lens shader. Let me go ahead and close that. You can create your own custom bokeh images to use and create different types of effects. You can use the one that comes with this tutorial. Like, go ahead, feel free to use it for whatever you like. Just make sure it's got an alpha map. The one that comes with this tutorial does have an alpha map. That's basically how you use this new bokeh lens shader. Okay, so I'm going to close this. The next thing I'm going to do, which is very important before I end this video, I'm going to come over here to render pass options, go back to output over here, and I'm going to go ahead and render out an actual image. So let's come in here and let's change the name to HDRI. Let's just call it HDRI photo. There's a reason why I'm doing that. Select this render channel here, this render output, click on edit, and in this PPG switch from a Softimage pick file to a Radiance HDR. We're going to go ahead and render ourselves out an HDR image here. Hit the back button to go back to this window over here. Okay, leave everything exactly how it is except for this. Let's close that. Let's go to render and go ahead and click on render frame. We're going to render out this frame really quick. The reason I'm doing this is I'm setting this up for the next video. In the next video we're going to use the photographic exposure shader. And I know we talked about the photographic exposure shader in the first volume of this mental ray rendering series, but there's a little something that I want to show you with that shader, which is a neat way of working with it in conjunction with a scene like this. So this scene is perfect for using a photographic exposure shader, so I wanted to bring it back in and elaborate on it just a little bit more since it pertains to what we're doing here. And by rendering out this HDR image right here, we're going to be able to use that with the photographic exposure shader to do lightning fast previews. And if that doesn't make any sense right now, it'll make perfect sense when we get to the next video. So I'm just going to let this finish rendering out. I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video we'll pick up where I left off here and keep working.